Welcome. Welcome to our webinar on College and Career Ready IEPs, Improving Outcomes for Students 3 through 21 on the 5-step process. Today we're going to talk about Step 5, Analyzing Progress, and our presenters today are Daniel Parker, Deb Heiss, Anita Castro, and Paula Volpiansky, all from the Special Education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the Step 5 of the 5-step process of the CCR IEP development. Most of the information in this presentation is summarized and supported by our one-page Step 5 at a Glance handout. A copy of this presentation with speaker notes and at a glance handouts are available on the CCR IEP Step 5 Learning Resources page. We always like to point out as we begin our webinars the importance of the CCR IEP 5 beliefs. These 5 core beliefs are essential to developing IEPs that promote college and career readiness. These beliefs have an important impact on the success of students with IEPs, and districts, IEP teams, and including families should consider and discuss these beliefs when they're thinking about IEP discussions and development. These beliefs are high expectations, culturally responsive practices, positive student relationships, family and community engagement, and collective responsibility. In Step 5, collective responsibility certainly has a major role to play in terms of everyone looking and reviewing the progress of the IEP. For more information about these 5 beliefs, please visit the CCR IEP Resources webpage. So, again, a reminder, College and Career Ready IEPs are developed through a cyclical 5-step process in which each step informs the next. To learn more about all 5 steps, please refer to the resources on our CCR IEP Learning Resources webpage. We have webinars on each of these 5 steps. It would be highly suggested to review the previous webinars if you are listening to this webinar. We also want to remind you that we developed a nice little 5-step process chart. You can see Step 5 is kind of at the bottom of this chart because Step 5 can inform all 4 levels of the CCR IEP, all 4 steps of the CCR IEP process. This chart can be used either as a training tool when explaining the steps or a place to take notes when preparing for IEP team meetings, during IEP team meetings, or when reviewing IEPs. Now we're going to go ahead and review the 5-step process, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Deb Heiss.
Thanks, Daniel. Step 5 is a very critical step, and the revised forms now help the team document a part of the IEP process that was rarely documented, the basis of decisions about a student's progress and whether the student is making sufficient progress towards meeting either early childhood or grade level academic standards and functional expectations. 2 new forms were developed to assist IEP teams with this step. The first is the Interim Review of IEP Goals, I-6, and the second is the Annual Review of IEP Goals, I-5. We will talk about these forms a bit more later in the presentation. Step 5 represents 3 main tasks because it encompasses both ongoing progress monitoring as well as scheduled IEP team reviews. The first task, if you will, is to begin IEP implementation and then collect ongoing data to monitor student progress. To do this, you will use the methods outlined in the IEP goals during Step 3. We will be developing further webinars about data collection for progress monitoring in the future. So for today, we will focus on the next 2 steps. One is to regularly report this progress and to review the progress and to report it to parents. It's important to remember that you should report to parents based on the schedule that is delineated in each student's IEP. And then finally, the IEP team meets and formally reviews progress at least once a year. Depending on the purpose of the meeting, the team could use either the I-6, the interim review, or for that annual review, the I-5. We want to emphasize that the overall purpose of this step is to review the effectiveness of the IEP in addressing the student's disability-related needs related to progress towards grade level or early childhood standards and expectations. Obviously, reviewing this progress helps us identify what is working and what needs to change. When a student is not making sufficient progress towards achieving IEP goals and closing achievement gaps, the CCR IEP 5-step process provides an excellent framework for reviewing and revising the IEP. For instance, the IEP team should return to step 1 and consider what team members know about the student, including student strengths and current levels of performance in various curricular and functional areas, classes, and in different settings. In this way, the summary and analysis of progress becomes part of the current level of performance statement for the next IEP. Now let's spend a little bit of time on major activities associated with Step 5. The first major task of analyzing student progress to review IEP goal progress in an ongoing fashion. Ongoing collection of progress data is necessary for a reliable review of progress. Each IEP goal includes a statement of the methods for measuring progress. A well-developed statement will include the type, method, source of progress data, and frequency of data collection. Each goal page, read as a whole, should provide guidelines for determining adequate progress. Applying the procedures used to measure progress from baseline to level of attainment are often referred to as progress monitoring. Progress monitoring typically refers to an ongoing process and not a single event. So the decision about how progress from baseline towards level of attainment will be measured should allow for the collection of multiple data points during each monitoring period. In other words, there must be enough information each time to determine if progress is sufficient, so this can be reported to the parent. Adequate progress means the student will be expected to meet the annual anticipated level of attainment listed in the goal. It would not be valid, as you're carrying this out, to base this decision on one observation, one quiz, one probe, or other single assessment. As you know, the IEP must state when the IEP progress will be reported to parents, because teachers are regularly and deliberately reviewing student progress and adjusting instruction. Periodic progress data is summarized and reported to the parents, and districts may use the IEP interim review of IEP goals for this periodic reporting. Quite frequently, IEP progress is reported on the same schedule as general education progress reports and report cards. Usually, periodic reporting of progress is done outside of an IEP team meeting. Sometimes teachers and parents will meet informally to go over student progress. Teachers should also consider including students in such periodic reviews. Reviewing and reporting progress regularly is also important, so needed IEP revisions can be made in a timely fashion when students either meet the goals before the end of the IEP or when they are not making sufficient progress in response to typical adjustments to instruction after a reasonable period of time. Okay, here are some tips to analyze IEP goal progress. The same basic steps are followed when reviewing IEP goal progress, whether the review occurs as part of regular instructional progress monitoring, information with the parents as when reporting progress, or more formally, when an IEP team meeting is held when interim changes are needed because a student has met goals before the end of the IEP term or when the student is not making sufficient progress. This could also be when the IEP team meets to conduct an annual IEP review. So here are some basic steps for completing this IEP goal progress analysis. In step 5, you're going to compile and analyze all the data collected during ongoing progress monitoring. Then compare the baseline to current level of progress to determine if progress is sufficient. If this is the final analysis before the end of the annual IEP team meeting, ask if the student has met the expected level of attainment as written in the IEP. Based on this analysis, some decisions need to be made as to what happens next. If the student has not made sufficient progress, an interim IEP team meeting may need to be conducted to conduct a more thorough review and to make needed IEP decisions. At this time, if the progress is insufficient, the team is also going to be looking at things like considering a task analysis. Does the student need short-term objectives or benchmarks? Are there different or additional service needs that are going to be part of the decision-making progress? If the goal is met, the IEP team may need to meet and determine what's next. Is it important to increase the level of attainment, increase the level of complexity? Is the goal no longer needed? When the student is easily meeting one or more IEP goals prior to the end of the current IEP, it's really important to ask, have the disability-related needs been accurately identified? So that relates to, are the goals sufficiently ambitious, and are these the right goals? If substantive changes are needed to address IEP goals or services, an IEP team meeting will likely be necessary. In a bit, we will discuss what happens when this analysis occurs during an annual IEP team meeting. So in step 5, there are 2 new forms that were developed to assist IEP team meetings, as already mentioned. The first is the interim review of IEP goals, and the second is the annual review of IEP goals. Anita Castro will explain those forms to us next.
So the 2 requirements that are on this slide are really foundational for the review of the IEP. The first one is about the IEP team must identify the procedures that will be used to measure the student's progress toward meeting the annual goal from baseline to level of attainment. And some examples of procedures include work samples, classroom tests, observation logs, attendance records, and pointer tally sheets. Remember, the measures used to determine progress must align with the baseline and level of attainment measures. Then the IEP team must also determine when reports about the student's progress toward meeting the annual goal will be provided to parents. Parents of students with disabilities must be informed periodically about their students' progress toward meeting the measurable annual goals. Interim reporting on annual goal progress may be done through quarterly or other periodic reports issued concurrently with report cards. And remember, as Deb said, parents must be informed of progress towards the annual goal at least as often as parents of non-disabled students are informed of progress, and that's why the report card timing is often used. The interim review of IEP goals, or Form I-6, may be used for the periodic reports of IEP goal progress. Often, progress on IEP goals is reported on a quarterly basis, as we mentioned, in association with the report cards, but you could include this form as part of your report. During the interim review, if a student is not making sufficient progress toward achieving their IEP goals, the IEP team should consider revising the IEP to address lack of progress. Remember, an LEA may change an IEP without an IEP team meeting after the annual IEP team meeting if the parent and the LEA agree. And an IEP team meeting is required when considering a change in the student's placement. And remember, that includes changing the amount of time that a student is removed from the regular education environment. So on the I-4 form, or the interim review of IEP goals, you can document the date when the IEP was reviewed. For example, if the IEP is reviewed quarterly, document each date the IEP is reviewed. For each goal then, include the goal number, and we're looking at the form specifically, include the goal number and the goal statement, the baseline, and the anticipated level of attainment. And this allows then for easy comparison with the student's current level of performance when you get to some of the columns to the right. And don't forget to include short-term objectives or benchmarks when you're reviewing the goal. And often electronic IEP systems can easily copy and paste this type of information in terms of what is the goal, what is the baseline and level of attainment, so that you don't have to retype all of that information. Then indicate by checking yes or no if the student is making sufficient progress toward achieving the goal within the specified time period, and use data that is comparable to the baseline measurement. Document the data used to determine if the student is making sufficient progress then in the next column. Again, include results that are comparable to the baseline measurement. We talked about that quite a bit in webinar 3. For example, if the baseline states given 100 single-syllable words at the beginning first grade level, the student is able to accurately decode 50% of the words, then an appropriate statement for measuring progress might be, progress data shows given 100 single-syllable words at the beginning first grade level, the student is now able to decode 75% of the words. So you can see where the language is very parallel and therefore easy to compare. And also we're just looking at one skill at a time, so that is also an easier way to make those comparisons. For any goals or short-term objectives the student is not making sufficient progress towards, then identify the factors that are affecting the student's lack of progress. And consider new strategies, interventions, or revisions to the IEP to address those factors that are affecting progress. And it may be necessary, as Daniel said, to re-examine the effects of the student's disability on progress and the disability-related needs, and revise the IEP as appropriate to address any new needs that have been identified. And then lastly, document the date that the progress report is shared with parents. So the IEP team must review at least annually to determine if the annual goals are being achieved. So this is in regards to the annual review requirements. The annual review must occur during an IEP team meeting, which includes all the required participants, including the student, when appropriate, and the student's parents. And a regular education teacher of the student as a member of the IEP team must participate in the review and revision of the IEP. This is a procedural requirement, as we all know, but it also harkens back to one of the 5 beliefs of CCR IEP development, that being collective responsibility, that Daniel mentioned as one of the important beliefs that really affects this step. Excuse me. The regular education teacher brings a perspective of what is expected in the general education classroom, a perspective on what same-age peers are achieving, and firsthand knowledge of the student's strengths and struggles and possible reasons why the student is struggling. The annual review occurs before developing new goals. In other words, the IEP team must review the previous IEP goals and progress before developing the next IEP. The IEP team must revise the IEP then to address any lack of expected progress towards the annual goal or progress in the general education curriculum. Also to address the results of any reevaluations, information from the parents or to the parents, and any new anticipated needs of the student, I should say. If the student did not make the expected progress, the IEP team might want to consider the effects of the disability on progress, as well as any special factors that might be affecting progress, as well as the results of reevaluation and information provided by the parents when determining why the student didn't meet the goal. And just as a caution, typically repeating the same goal with the same level of attainment would not be appropriate for the IEP team to do. You want to clearly explain any lack of progress and develop a plan to address the lack of progress. So continuing to have the same goals and services when there was no progress previously would not make sense. Let's talk a little bit about short-term objectives next with the next slide. And this is just a reminder that if your goal includes short-term objectives, then benchmarks or short-term objectives are read as part of the annual goal statement. So when benchmarks or short-term objectives are used to measure the annual goal, all benchmarks or short-term objectives must be met. In other words, each level of attainment attained for each short-term objective in order for the goal to be considered met. Progress monitoring measures must align with the baseline and level of attainment measures in order to determine progress. So as is true with the goal, in that the baseline and level of attainment must be aligned, that is also true for short-term objectives. The annual review of progress towards the goal therefore includes a review of the progress towards the short-term objectives. And we developed Form I-5, which is the annual review of IEP goals, to document the annual review and progress towards the goals. The purpose of the review is to determine if the student met the previous year's goals and short-term objectives, and if not, to address the lack of progress through the development of the new annual IEP. This may include revising or adding goals and services. A review of the previous IEP goals and progress will help the IEP team consider if new goals and services are needed. Again, it would not be appropriate to see the same goals and services in the IEP if the student did not meet the previous goals in the previous IEP. List the goals or short-term objectives from the previous IEP. Remember to include the goal number, and again, electronic IEP software, it's easy to cut and paste this kind of information right into this annual review. Provide the student's current level of achievement, and here we're suggesting that you can summarize that data in the box, or you could attach a report if that would be more appropriate. Remember, again, the data must align. You must be able to compare it with the baseline and level of attainment measures so that you can determine the amount of progress. If the student did not meet a goal, describe how the IEP will be revised to address the lack of progress. Again, review effects of the disability and a summary of the disability-related needs to examine why the student did not make sufficient progress toward the goal. It's important to understand what impact the student's disability is having on academic achievement and functional performance, and address the student's disability-related needs. So although that was considered early on in the process in step 2, as Daniel mentioned and Deb as well, we're really revisiting that 5-step process at this point if the goals have not been met. And it may be necessary to conduct an entire new root cause analysis to determine why the student isn't making sufficient progress, and that's okay to revisit that step with the root cause analysis. Remember to revise the IEP then to address the disability-related needs, and any revisions that are documented on this I-5 then should be reflected in the new IEP. And now Paul, I think, is going to talk about some tips for IEP review.
Great. Thanks, Anita. So let's kind of take a couple steps back to the IEP team discussion, which is like, how do you get to the place where you document the information on the forms that Anita just shared with us? We need to document progress towards meeting goals and addressing needs, as Anita said. We've already mentioned some of these tips, and Daniel touched on some of them, as did Anita and Deb. But we want to reinforce that when going through step 5, which is analyzing progress towards goals and addressing needs, the team may naturally be drawn back through all the steps. And Anita just alluded to that, which is sometimes if a student isn't making progress, you need to go back and reflect back on the effects of the disability-related needs, and perhaps even the information you originally used to get to the place you did. So you may naturally be drawn back through all the steps of the process. The questions on this slide might be helpful when you're talking about step 5 in relation to the other steps. And I'll pause it for a second for you to read them. But basically looking at the current information, if the student is not making progress, again, as Anita mentioned, Did you really do the root cause analysis? Do you need to go back and look at that again? Sometimes there might be information that you weren't aware of when you originally wrote the goals that may have now come up, or things that you learned through implementing the goals about the student's strengths and needs that you didn't know before. So we'll touch on those in a second. So let me go into more detail, since a big part of step 5 is analyzing goal progress. Here are a few tips for doing that. When you're looking at the progress data, and again, you should always have enough information at the table to really be able to analyze the progress. So when you look at the progress data, look at the rate of progress. Look at the trend. Is the student making reasonably quick progress? What is the rate? Because looking at that rate of progress, assuming that you've been implementing well-matched instruction to the need, you should be able to use that rate of progress to help you develop the next goal so that it will be ambitious and achievable. If the goal isn't met, consider breaking it down. Did the student have the sub-skills necessary? In other words, was the goal not necessarily too ambitious, but was it a reasonable goal to have? Do we need to develop some short-term objectives or some benchmarks? Also related to this, looking at the services that we provided. If we have a goal, did we provide sufficient direct service to the student, specially designed instruction? Did we provide enough supports in the environment so that the student could meet the goal? Maybe we need to change those. If the goal is met, as well as not met, we still always need to look at what's next. But the goal is met. If the goal has already been met, so we're either having an interim meeting because the student has already met their goals and they're doing great and we need to move forward, or it's the annual review, we really should think about various things. Do we want to increase the level of attainment? In other words, do we want to just move to closing the gap further? Do we want to increase the complexity of the skills? If the student has mastered some other skills, do we want to move forward in complexity? Do we maybe want the goal to be reworded or rethought in terms of, instead of skill development, perhaps it's about generalization and increasing independence and being able to demonstrate the skill? Or perhaps the goal really is not needed anymore and we want to move on to something that is more appropriate to the changing effects of the disability and the changing needs of the student. So the primary purpose of step 5 is really to analyze progress towards the goals that were developed, to address the needs that stem from this analysis, and to then be able to use that information to develop a revised IEP to keep us on the track of closing gaps and addressing needs. This slide really is just a reminder of the links between step 5 and the other steps, and we've mentioned that already in various ways, but so that here it's summarized. After you analyze the progress data, now in fact you have more information than when you originally developed the goal, and this information, as Deb suggested, takes you back to step 1. So you would add that to your current level of performance. In fact, you would rewrite the current level of performance with the new information. So you have more information. And again, someone already mentioned, I think Anita just already mentioned, that if the student isn't meeting the goal, you would back chain, meaning you'd go backwards. You would look at the goal you have, you'd look at the service you had, and look at the links between them. You would then perhaps trace back through the effects of disability, the root causes, the needs, and the current levels of performance to see if perhaps you need to rethink those things or elaborate on them in some other way. You also need to consider other factors that could influence progress in student learning other than just the goal and the things we've mentioned. The next 2 slides really do address some of the ways of thinking about all of the factors that may be affecting learning that you would definitely want to look at, not only when you're designing goals, but also when you're reviewing progress. Instruction is how instruction's provided, the different methods being used, curriculum is the content that you're doing, environment or how the environment is structured for the student to learn, whether it's large group, small group, different things in the environment, and obviously the learner themselves, which we talk about a lot when we talk about disability-related needs and effects of that particular student's disability. Some people find this lens of these four components helpful as looking at sources of information or sources for information that may be related to improving access, engagement, and progress. Another lens that you can fit this into is the Universal Design for Learning lens. That's another framework to look at. Again, all of the four things I just mentioned, instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner, also fit into universal design, and you can see how those things relate. When we're looking at this framework, we can think about the items in the three categories as being either potential barriers or supports to students' learning. And I guess I want to pause a little bit and let you look at this and perhaps think of the example Daniel gave with a student who may not be making sufficient progress in their reading comprehension. And I'd like you, just for a bit, to just look at the first category of engagement. Think about what barrier, perhaps, from engagement might relate or influence progress towards improving reading comprehension. For an example, a student may have some issues, other needs related to maintaining attention. So a barrier in the environment might be that the instruction is not structured in a way to assist the student in maintaining attention. It may be too long, the group size may be too large. So the engagement, being able to make sure that the student is engaged in the instructional activity might be one example.
And some of the ones people have been typing in, student can't sit still to read, so that would be a functional skill. Persistence, that's another. Methodology of the instruction.
And that would go in probably in the, I'm guessing in one of the other two.
Student is not interested in the material, needs to have more voice and choice. Personal interest relevancy, self-regulation. So we're getting lots of good ideas here.
And self-regulation may be that the student doesn't and needs to also develop some ability to check their own attention or to check their own sensory state when they're learning.
And now we have Diana from CESA 8, who's with our Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative, who's going to talk a little bit about family engagement and Step 5 of the CCR IEP process. Welcome, Diana.
Hi, thank you. I'm Diana Ziegler, and I work with WISPE through CESA 8 right now, and I am very happy to be here and share this information with you. So what families need to know in Step 5 of the CCR IEP process. In order for families to be a part of the IEP team and process, families need to understand what it is that is being analyzed and evaluated. Families need to understand that it is not the student being analyzed and evaluated, but the function of the IEP itself. In order to understand the function of the IEP, we need to be sure that families can do the following. They need to understand the level of performance and function at the beginning of the implementation of the IEP, which is Step 1. How the student's disability affects performance and function, Step 2. In order to understand goals that have been set up, Step 3. And why specific instruction, services, supports, and accommodations were put in place, Step 4, so that the student progress can be clearly identified. Families need to participate in reviewing the implementation of the IEP, and this is necessary in order to inform the formation of future IEPs and the function of future IEP meetings. It is important that families understand the methods used to monitor the progress of the student, daily, weekly, quarterly, How is the progress being monitored throughout the school year to allow for the annual review of goals? What ways may the student use to demonstrate knowledge? And finally, families need to know that their input is important and valued in the identification of what is working and what may need to change in order to support the student in closing his or her achievement gaps. What questions can we ask families as we work to analyze student progress toward achievement and functional performance that will help them share information with the team? The questions listed here will allow families to contribute to the conversation. What is shared by the family can be used to enhance analyzation of IEP implementation and evaluate what has been effective in closing those achievement gaps. Because we are analyzing progress of the whole child, the first question, what are some ways the family has viewed progress toward goals at home and in the community, helps educators understand the effectiveness of those services and supports that were put into place as they pertain to functional performance outside of the classroom. What services or supports does the family believe have been effective and why can bring a new perspective to educators in understanding the true scope of some of the supports, services, or accommodations put into place. Even with healthy discussion of the reasoning behind some of the choices made in creating the IEP, it is likely there will be effects of programming that had not previously been considered. This will assist in the true evaluation of what works and what does not work. What the family sees that might be helpful is an important component of the IEP. As a general rule, families know their student in a more all-encompassing way than educators do. As families may have been thinking outside the box for this one child, they may have ideas that school personnel had not considered. Understanding with which adults in the school both the student and the family have a healthy relationship affords the opportunity to provide encouragement, support, and constructive criticism that will be more readily accepted by the student and the family. This relationship will allow the student to comfortably seek assistance, which in turn assists in the implementation of the IEP, which then allows for a more complete analysis and evaluation of the process. Let's talk about tips for school staff to help families in the analyzation and evaluation process. The first tip simply reiterates a tip that was shared in discussion of step 1 of the 5-step process. We must acknowledge that parents are their child's first teacher, and it's sometimes difficult for families to trust that the information, observations, and perspectives shared by others really represents their child. It may take time for some families to understand and in some cases accept their child's ability to reach those ambitious and achievable goals. Families need to feel that you know their child and care before they can trust that you are working with them, and the relationship is not an us and a them, but a we. Explain how you monitored the student's progress in ways that families will understand. In preparing for the IEP team meeting, review your notes and ask yourself, if you were not an educator, would you understand the process for monitoring student progress? And in addition to explaining your monitoring process, provide tangible examples of how you reached your conclusions. Whether you used prepared charts and chicken scratches, or daily logging, or anything in between, allow the parents or the guardians to see what you are doing. It's important that parents are aware of what that report will look like, so they are able to give it the attention necessary in their participation on the IEP team. Be sure to let parents know how often they will receive the report, so they will be on the lookout in order to stay abreast of their students' progress. And perhaps most important, when asking questions about progress the family sees at home and in the community, take notes. When families share what they believe works and why, take notes. In this way, you are physically demonstrating that the family's input is important in the process. In addition, You will have concrete examples of the child's response to services and supports outside of the classroom that can be used in developing the annual IEP. By showing an acknowledgement of family contributions, you are assisting in the positive construction of the IEP team as a true team. Remember, trust is a difficult thing, and acknowledging the value of family contribution helps to build the trust that is needed to be a truly effective team.
All right, thank you, Diana. We really appreciate that information about engaging families in Step 5. Take care.
Very helpful there. Thanks.
We also like to talk about how IEP teams can engage students in each step of the 5-step process. We know how important student engagement is in self-determination and their IEPs. So involving students in the development of IEPs leads to greater student ownership and understanding of their educational program and its outcomes. And this applies to students of all ages and all developmental levels. All students can and should have some way and some roles of engaging in the IEP process. Here's a few ideas for engaging students in Step 3. Having a system for preparing the student to participate in the IEP team meeting, providing explanations of IEP terminology using language the student understands, asking students to talk about their year thus far and what's working well and why, and maybe talking about what's not working out so well and why they think that things aren't working out, and asking students what they think would help them better achieve their IEP goals. Definitely don't limit it to these ideas. IEP teams should really think about other ways that they can engage individual learners in the IEP process.
This slide is taken pretty much summarized from our at-a-glance document, and you should have that in your handouts. But the at-a-glance documents that we developed include examples of what we would expect to see in practice or what we would hope not to see. We've already mentioned a lot of this. I would like to emphasize, again, the expectation is that teams must have the data and information needed for the analysis of the progress, for one, to analyze the progress, as well as to have a conversation about what is and may not be working, as well as we would want to address the needs and help the students make progress to goals. Also, we need the information so that we can move to the next step of how to revise the IEP as appropriate.
And Paula, I think you also had some additional ideas that you wanted to share about Step 5 and monitoring of progress of the IEP. So why don't you go ahead and do that now?
One thing I want to backchain. One of the points that was being made had to do with how the information gets shared with families and how to be upfront and to make sure that that data is available and you're collecting it and able to explain to parents. And you know, we're talking about Step 5, which is analyzing progress, but in all truth, the analysis of progress occurs before you get to a meeting where you're reviewing the progress. So the data needed to analyze progress towards goals comes from the goal statement. The baseline and level of attainment provide the boundaries for what you're looking at as far as progress, and the methods that are listed to measure progress tell you how you're supposed to collect that data. So the information, you know, when you actually have Step 5 should already exist. It should already have been collected in an ongoing fashion while the goal is being worked on by the various folks that may be working in it, while specially designed instruction is provided, while supplementary aids and services are provided, and in the different environments that that goal may be worked on, whether it's general ed, special ed, across environments. So that the suggestion is that staff involved in collecting the progress data should summarize and bring the summary to the meeting. So when the team convenes to review progress, that data is already there. Now, obviously, if if parents ever want to see the tick marks, and I think one example were tick marks or tally marks on napkins. No, I don't know if that was it, but that data should be made available if people want to see the source of that. So I guess in relation to that, the data that is needed to review progress during this step should already be in existence, and the folks involved in collecting it should be ongoing analyzing it so that if an interim meeting may be required because the student isn't making progress, or if, again, the student has already met the goal, you would then want to schedule a meeting to carry out step 5. The last point that I would like to make is that this step in particular is really dependent upon having a system in place so that progress can be monitored. And these are just some thoughts for those of you in positions to really address the system issues. We need to make sure our staff have procedures and schedules for reviewing the IEP goals, and that is part of their daily instructional practices. We need to ensure that the high-quality interventions, specially designed instructions and supports that we have identified that are going to be appropriately matched to address the goals are implemented with fidelity. We need to make sure everybody has access to the information they need to review the IEPs, and we need to make sure that educators really know how to monitor progress and analyze progress data. So those are some of those system checks.
For each step in the 5-step process, we have a step check document and an at-a-glance document, and these include step checklists. So we encourage IEP teams to take a look at the Step 5 Analyze Progress Step Check checklist. It asks things like, has the IEP team compiled all the data collected using the methods to monitor progress identified in the IEP goals? Has the team analyzed all the data collected to date to monitor IEP goals? Considered other available data or information related to needs and goals, such as other classroom data, information provided by the parent, classroom teachers, perhaps a student? Have you reviewed progress reports provided by the parents? And if it's an interim review, has the IEP team analyzed the data to determine if progress will be sufficient for a student to meet the annual goal, compared with the baseline and the level of attainment that is outlined in each IEP goal? And then finally, again, engaging the student in progress monitoring. There are some great resources on self-monitoring, specifically that can be useful actually either for academic or behavior-related or functional-related social-emotional types of skills. So you can look at additional resources on student self-monitoring that could inform data to help with analyzing progress.
Okay, next, before we go into some of the resources for this webinar, we're just going to cut into a question that we received during the live webinar and share that question and response with you now. So here is the question.
And they kind of ask a question about a student, and I'll pop it up here, a student who has maybe a specific learning disability. That's the impairment area that got them the gateway to an IEP, and they have some behavior challenges. And in this scenario, the IEP team determined that those behaviors are not related to the student's disability, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But how and where does DPI expect this to be documented in the IEP? Would we expect that there to be something in special factors, goals, services in the IEP? If so, what happens to the part where you have to tie it to a disability-related need? As the SLD, consultant who does support specific learning disability guidance, and SLD is specific learning disability. Deb, do you want to talk about, do you get questions about behavior-related needs and students that are identified as eligible under specific learning disability?
Absolutely. I think that, and I appreciate the fact that you started off saying, Daniel, that the IEP team looks at eligibility criteria, but whether those eligibility criteria are for specific learning disability or intellectual disability. Once a child has been determined to have that disability, once they're eligible for special education services, then I think that's really where the 5-step process comes into play. As the IEP team is needing to design that IEP for the student, they're going to look at whatever the needs of that child are. And it's not synonymous with the eligibility criteria or label. So, you know, I guess in this instance, I would recommend, just as we've been talking about, going back to that 5-step process, specifically going back to step 2, and looking at what the child's challenges are, and how that comes into play.
You know, I'm going to send, there's on our IEP resources page, there's a really good link to a letter from the Department of Education talking about the importance of considering positive behaviors and intervention supports for students with IEPs.
Yeah.
And we have to remind people that the eligibility criteria does not dictate what the services are for a student. That is based on the discussion of present levels in relation to academic and functional skills. So if that student is not meeting the functional expectations around behaviors as other students with IEPs, that should be documented in the IEP and it should be addressed. And in the letter from the Department of Education, they explicitly give the example of a student with a specific learning disability, and when there have been complaints or other types of filings at the state level in various states, if the IEP team says, well, the student has SLD, so we don't address behavior, that is a big red flag and often can get the districts into some trouble. So we would highly recommend really rethinking how that student's behaviors need to be addressed and supported in the IEP.
I thank you for thinking of that letter, Daniel, because that's real help. And for me, when I talk with people who may call on the phone also and have this question, you know, it just really helps me to think of it in terms of you write the IEP that the student needs, and that those needs are not dictated by an eligibility label in any way.
Okay. We want to thank everyone for participating in our webinar today and those who are accessing this webinar online. And thank you to all of our presenters. You can access several College and Career Ready IEP resources on the CCR IEP webpage. You can do a quick internet search for CCR IEP Wisconsin DPI and find our internet pages. There are several resources specific to Step 5. There's some great resources from the Wisconsin RTI Center and other resources at the DPI on supporting analyzing progress. There's also some external resources that may be helpful in this area as well. Finally, we have several family engagement resources that are collected on a live binder. You can also find those on the CCR IEP webpage, and family and community engagement is one of our 5 beliefs. So thank you again, everyone, for participating in this webinar. Please fill out and provide us with any feedback or questions that you may have through the DPI CCR IEP resources webpage. Thank you.